Hi everyone, sorry I can't see your presentations, but here's mine. The vocal minority of the delegates to the First Continental Congress wanted independence rather than reconciliation. Though the radicals were few, they pushed hard for action against Great Britain. While a fight for independence had emerged as a serious possibility, the specifics of taking arms against their mother country had not yet come to fruition. Through diaries, letters, and records of the proceedings, it can be said that the vocal radical minority wanted to push back against Great Britain, whatever the consequences. Ultimately, this would result in the Revolutionary War, though the details for militant rebellion would not emerge until the Second Continental Congress convened. As early as 1764, tensions had been growing between the two continents. The Sugar Act of 1764 was passed because of the expensive French and Indian War that Great Britain had just got done fighting. Though it lowered the molasses tax on imported molasses, it restricted trade in the colonies. Papers were required for all merchants to describe what was in their shiploads, and it dictated where and what they could send their goods. If papers were not had by these merchants, they could be tried in vice admiralty courts, which means that they would be tried by one British official and not a jury of their peers. The Stamp Act in 1765 taxed paper. The colonists were upset because they claimed that Parliament had no right to tax them since they were not represented. They did have advisors, such as Ben Franklin, on committees in Parliament, but the colonists did not recognize them as official representatives. The Declaratory Act, passed the next year, repealed the Stamp Act, but so in order for Parliament to not feel that they had given in to the colonies, they decided that the Declaratory Act said that Great Britain controlled the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Coercive Acts of 1774 were dubbed intolerable by the colonists. The Boston Port Act was the first of these, and it closed the Boston port until the destroyed tea of the famous Boston Tea Party had been paid for. Not all members of Parliament agreed. Rose Fuller and William Dowdeswell, both members of the House of Commons, opposed the Boston Port Act, but they were in the minority and it passed anyway. The Massachusetts Regulatory Act was passed in order to force the colonists of Massachusetts into submission. The colonists still got to elect representatives to their house, but its counterpart, the Council, was made up of officials appointed by the Crown. Also, anyone tried for anything in America was held by a jury of members elected by the Crown instead of their peers. The Impartial Administration of Justice Act claimed that officials who committed crimes in America could be tried elsewhere, including England. The colonists didn't think that was fair, because if they were sent to England, they may not get the punishment they deserved for the act was committed in America. The Quartering Act required private families to house and feed troops in order to offset the cost of keeping them in America. That angered the colonists because none of the families wanted to do so. The Quebec Act established a Catholic religion in the newly acquired territory Quebec, Canada. It was seen as intolerable because if Great Britain established a formal religion in one of its provinces, it would not be long before that also came to America. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5th, 1774. On the very second day, Patrick Henry of Virginia claimed that government was dissolved, and therefore he wanted a new one right then and there. A few members may have agreed with him, but none of them spoke up at that time. And therefore, that was the last time that Henry openly called for war in the Congress. The Suffolk Resolves, penned by Dr. Joseph Warren in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, arrived at the Congress on September 17th, just 12 days after it had convened. The resolves were passed unanimously, but they were not reconciliatory, for they claimed that George III was a tyrant who must be stopped. They also said that Great Britain was attempting to enslave colonial America, and that the intolerable acts were unconstitutional. They considered royal officials to be enemies, and anyone who supported them were also. The Suffolk Resolves wanted colonial militias to be assembled, which Suffolk had already done. They also called for a boycott of British goods. Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania and James Duane of New York opposed the Suffolk Resolves. Galloway stated that the Suffolk Resolves were a complete declaration of war against Great Britain, and that the foundation of military resistance had been laid. Therefore, he proposed a plan for union on September 28th. His plan included a distant House of Parliament called the Grand Council to be established in America. The representatives in the Grand Council would be elected by the people, and therefore they would have proper representation. The king would appoint a President General to preside over all the meetings, and laws concerning colonial America had to be passed by both Parliament and the Grand Council in America. His plan for union was supported by James Duane of New York, the one who opposed the Suffolk Resolves, John Jay of New York, and Edward Rutledge of South Carolina. It was, however, opposed by Patrick Henry. His concern was corruption. If Parliament was corrupt at the time, which even Joseph Galloway admitted, why would its potential American counterpart be any different? The plan for union was rejected in order to be struck from the minutes. That can be seen as evidence that reconciliation was not a priority to many of the delegates. Meanwhile, General Thomas Gage, the Royal Military Commander and Governor of Boston, was building forts and securing ammunition in the town because he feared that an armed rebellion was about to begin. A friend and former soldier under the command of General George Washington in the French and Indian War, named Robert Mackenzie, was stationed as a troop in Boston. He wrote to Washington that he believed the entire continent, not just those colonists, wanted war. George Washington, a delegate at the Congress from Virginia, said that the colonists would not submit to Parliament and that the recent acts must be repealed or blood would be shed, meaning war. John Adams, the pacifist and delegate from Massachusetts, wrote to his wife Abigail on September 18th that none of the members would submit. And after hearing of Gage's actions in Boston, the whole of the Congress cried for war. He wrote to William Tudor, his law partner, on October 7th, saying that he believed many of them wanted to take the offensive, hoping the Congress would vote for money for arms and ammunition. Samuel Adams of Massachusetts wrote to Dr. Joseph Warren, the one who penned the Suffolk Resolves, on September 25th. He wrote that he believed the aims of many of the members of Congress were independence. He did not specify if he was one of them, and he said that they weren't necessarily talking about it in the Congress, but they were discussing it outside of doors when it was not in session. Several documents were written and released by the First Continental Congress near its end. A statement of violations of rights did just that, stated how their rights had been violated. The association called for a boycott of British goods. Neither of those specified what action would be taken if their liberties were not restored. However, the memorial to the inhabitants of the British colonies, penned by Richard Henry Lee of Virginia and passed October 21st, said that boycott, while though it may be inconvenient for the colonists, was necessary. He said that the colonists must submit to being slaves or prepare for a dangerous contest, meaning war was the only alternative. Thoughts of independence were in the minds of several of the delegates. Through diaries, letters, and records of the proceedings, proof of revolutionary ideas can be seen. The passage of the Suffolk Resolves and the rejection of the plan for union were actions that hinted at war. Though the radicals were few, they were adamant outside of Congress's doors that war was necessary. While it was obvious that the colonies were not prepared financially or logistically to wage war against Great Britain, that did not stop the idea from being suggested or spread. War was only a matter of time.